Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and today we are covering the state of the format, the state of Duskmourn Limited, which as we'll get into, I think is just going to be a banger of a format. I have really high hopes for this one. Today we're going to dive into what I think is going on in the format, how you want to approach it, some tips for winning a bit more, some traps that you'll want to avoid that I've already seen some people fall into. Lots to cover with this one, so let's just jump in. Okay, so on the agenda today, like I usually do for these State of the Format episodes, we got three main parts of this episode. One, just some big picture thoughts on the format, just the overview, the things I think are going to give context for the things that come after. Two, a breakdown of what I think are the most important archetypes, at least on week one, to talk about. Not going to be able to get to all the archetypes today, but I'm going to mention most of them at least, and I think just talking about the archetypes is a good vehicle to touch on some key cards, some really gluey cards that belong in multiple archetypes. And then we're going to cap things off with just some notable cards, some cards that I didn't really think belonged in this section or the archetype section, but are important to talk about. So we're going to start with those big picture thoughts, of course, and let's just start with some vibes. I mentioned a second ago that I think this set is going to be a banger. I think it's going to be really good just from my early impressions, from what I've heard the community members saying about this set. I can easily see this be my favorite set of 2024. It feels a lot like a Dave Humphries set without actually being one. I don't think he actually worked on it, at least wasn't a main designer. You know, the folks over at WotC, they kind of pop in and out of different sets. I'm sure there's, people are consulted for different sets here and there, but I don't think he was actually a main designer. And for those who don't know who Dave Humphries is, he's a WotC designer who has a reputation of producing some of the best limited formats we've ever had. He was lead designer on Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, on Call Time, Thunder Junction, among others. And I really feel like the other designers in the building, have taken a page from the good book of Dave. I feel like there's a lot of hallmarks of those sets baked into Duskmourn, and a lot of those factors, all those aspects of the set are things that generally I find limited players want in their set. So, kudos to the WotC team. I think they've done a good job of adjusting to what players are looking for out of a limited format. And one of the things that I think that players like in a limited format, and this set has, is fixing. We've got the 10 dual lands at the, quote unquote common slot, the 50% likely to be a dual land in your basic land slot. So just more fixing just makes it so that you can play more of your sweet cards, allows you to play a 3-color deck once in a while, a 2-color deck with a splash, a 5-color deck. I've already seen a few 5 to 4-color monstrosities. We've also, of course, got Terramorphic Expanse as an actual common in this set. I've always been a big fan of having about this amount of fixing. I think some of the sets in the past have gone overboard with fixing. Maybe Dominaria United is as a standout there, where a lot of decks did kind of devolve into like 3+ color nonsense stuff. But I think we've got just the right amount of fixing here, where it doesn't feel like you're like, well, I gotta play a 2-color deck because the mana's not good enough to play more than 2 colors very often, but also not so abundant where it's like, yep, I'm just getting all the good cards, grab all the good cards, grab all the land, that's how you're supposed to draft. It's just that nice middle ground where there's breathing room without it feeling like everything's devolving into soup. So fixing, really thumbs up on the fixing. I think they really nailed it in this set. This is one of the qualities that I think Dave Humphries often gets right too, so I just wanted to kind of make that comparison there. But I think even more than just the fixing situation, what really makes it feel like a Dave set to me is the way that the mechanics are interwoven and the way they overlap and the way that everything just kind of plays nicely with each other. So we had Bloomburrow as our last set, and in Bloomburrow, the lanes were fairly defined, right? There's definitely some give and take, some push and pull, some overlap with the mechanics. We had the duo cycle, which, played roles in multiple decks. But I would say for the most part, the cards in Bloomburrow, you could kind of be like, oh, this is for the rabbit deck, and this is for the lizard deck. Where in Duskmourn, I feel like it's way more flexible than that. And such a large part of that flexibility comes from the mechanics in this set. I think there's something to be said about a lot of the individual card designs too. But the mechanics and how they're interwoven with each other and how it feels like you can start your draft one place and end up in a pretty different place. And the cards you take early still fill a role in the deck you end up in, even though it's not the deck you were trying to draft early on. Like, for example, we take the Manifest Dread mechanic. There's cards that reference Manifest Dread. The blue-green archetype is all about that. But one of the greatest things about Manifest Dread is it's such a great Delirium enable. I think Manifest Dread alone contributes to Delirium being easier to turn on in this set than pretty much any other set that we've had, because not only is the action of Manifesting Dread going to put some cards in your graveyard, some hard to get card types in the graveyard too. Your lands, your artifacts, your enchantments, your cards that don't naturally go to the graveyard. Manifest Dread lets you do that game in, game out. But also just where you find the mechanic Manifest Dread, what kind of card types you see it on, directly contributes to enabling Delirium, because the card itself, Manifest Dread, is a sorcery that puts itself in the graveyard. So when you cast this card, you're most likely going to get 2 card types to Delirium. There's also rooms that will say when this enters Manifest Dread, or, when you unlock the room, Manifest Dread. And of course, that doesn't put the room in the graveyard, but that allows you to put more quote-unquote creatures, more things that affect the board in your deck, more enchantments, where you, in some other sets, just couldn't play, 7 enchantments, so you have that card type reliably for Delirium. So what this means as a drafter is you could be starting in a place where, you're going down like a blue-green Manifest Dread route, and you picked up an Oblivious Bookworm, an amazing uncommon here, 2 mana, 2/3, the beginning of your end step, you draw a card, then you discard a card unless a face-down permanent entered or was flipped up this turn. Just a phenomenal card, by the way, if you haven't caught wind. This is one of the best uncommons of the set. But anyways, let's just say you start drafting blue-green because of this card, and you pick up a bunch of Manifest Dread cards. But then you go, oh, okay, interesting, blue isn't that open, but black seems pretty open, and all your Manifest Dread cards just get to nicely slot into that Delirium deck. And then you've got all the blue-white, eerie, enchantment matter stuff, and a lot of the same things can be said that I just said about Manifest Dread, really greasing the wheels for Delirium. A lot of the same things, I think, can be applied to the blue-white enchantment stuff, because enchantments, once again, are one of the tougher card types to get into the graveyard. But if you make enchantment creatures, and there's a bunch of enchantment creatures in this set, well, those do make their way into the graveyard, as opposed to regular enchantments that just kind of stick on the battlefield. And so you could start drafting a blue-white deck, blue-white eerie enchantments, and then go, okay, well, it looks like actually white's not that open. You pivot into black, you end up with a black-blue, maybe sort of eerie still, but able to use the Delirium cards to good effect because you've got a lot of enchantments in your deck and likely creatures, likely instants, likely sorceries, maybe an artifact or 2. And so yeah, just a lot of overlap, and those are the big 3 main themes, right? We've got Manifest Dread, we've got Delirium, and we've got the eerie enchantment stuff. And it would be very satisfying if I could make a link between Manifest Dread and the eerie stuff. Those things tend not to have much overlap. Like, if you're truly doing the Oblivious Bookworm, I care about manifesting, I care about face-down permanents, or you're doing the eerie, like, I really care about enchantments, I want a ton of enchantments in my deck, it's kind of hard to pivot between those. It'd be really nice if there was like an overlap between all 3 of them, but really the overlap comes with the Delirium cards. And as I was laying all this out for this episode, something kind of clicked for me, because I realized that I'd been playing a ton of Delirium cards, just in general, like not even necessarily in a black-green Delirium deck or a red-green Delirium deck, but I noticed that a lot of the stronger Delirium cards just kind of made their way into my deck. And I think that's because so many of the other mechanics in the set allow you to turbo at Delirium, get Delirium at a very early point in the game. So wrapping this all together, as far as flexibility and what this means and what you're thinking about as you're drafting, is it's difficult to pivot from a heavy Manifest Dread deck to a heavy enchantment deck, but very easy to pivot from a heavy Manifest Dread deck to a Delirium deck, or an enchantment deck to a Delirium deck. And also, because most of the cards in this set just help you enable Delirium pretty well, I don't think you have to be a dedicated Delirium deck to put the good Delirium cards in your deck. And then the more zoomed out point that I'm trying to get at here is that drafting this set is very flexible. You should maintain a flexible mindset. Something that I'm going to touch on in a few minutes also is that I think for the most part, this is a pretty balanced set. There's not one of these strategies I think is great to lean towards and the other ones are really bad or anything. I think you should generally try to be reading your table, figuring out what's coming to you, making use of the cards that are coming to you, see what you've taken early, see how those early cards can mesh with the cards that are coming to you. And all that flexibility, I think, makes for a really good draft format. I think that people don't like feeling locked into their lane and being like, well, I'm doing this thing, let's take this thing because that's what the card says I should take, right? It's much more, you're the drafter, you're in charge, you're responsible for what your deck does and how your cards interact with each other. And then one final thought to cap this section off is that a lot of the cards have a lot of things you can be caring about. So you can care on Manifest Dread, for example, that it is a Manifest Dread card, or that it puts cards in the graveyard, or that it makes a 2/2, and that might matter for some of the red cards or the white cards that care about power 2 or less. You can have a card like Glimmerlight, which is actually one of the kind of underrated cards right now. This is the 2 mana equipment that makes an enchantment creature, and gives a creature +1/+1 with the equip cost being 1. This is an artifact, so that might be a card type you're missing for Delirium, that makes an enchantment that also plays well with a bunch of small creatures. So if your deck cares about any of those things, Glimmerlight is a card that you could want. And if you just go through all the cards in the set and dissect, like, what is this card doing? What does this offer to multiple different decks? You're going to find usually on most of the cards in the set 2 or 3 things that you could say, hey, I could see this deck wanting this because of this, just like I just dissected here with Glimmerlight. All right, and next up, I want to talk about the color balance of the set, the archetype balance. I think this is one of the more balanced sets we've had in quite a long time. Talking about colors first, none of the colors are unplayable by any means. I think that black is clearly the weakest, but not a bad color. I've had a lot of successful black decks. I've faced a bunch of scary black decks. The other 4 colors, I think, are all very close in power level. Black's issue generally is that it has just a lot of junky commons, where the other colors have just fewer junky commons, really. And to black's credit, I think part of what's currently bringing black's win rate down, if you're looking on 17 lands, is people are playing a lot of the black junky commons, where I think they could choose to play not as many of them. Like, if you're just looking at the play rates, how often people play this black card, a lot of the really, really bad ones, like we're talking like 50, 49% win rate, they're making their way into decks way more often than I think they should. And I think people are going to adjust and figure out the really junky ones. Anyways, we don't have to go really deep on black's issues right now, but I just wanted to say that, yeah, the other 4 colors are very, very close in power, and then the archetype spread, the 2 color pairs. So if you're just listening along, you're not going to be able to see this, but currently, if you're watching, I'm looking at the 17 lands breakdown of how well each archetype is performing, how well each 2 color pair is performing, and I think we're seeing some pretty promising things here. So one thing is that the range of the worst deck to the best deck is fairly narrow. We've got some outliers of the worst decks that are kind of finicky to put together. I'm going to touch on those in a second, but the best decks in the format, Boros and Azorius, they don't seem to be leagues better than the next best deck. Some formats you'll see where it's like, okay, the best deck is winning at 61%, and the next best deck is winning at like 57, and that's pretty damning, right? The worst 2 color pair right now is It, winning at 52%, and the best color pair is Azorius, winning at 58.8%, and that is a fairly large range, right? We're talking like 6, almost 7%. But if you take out the bottom 3 decks, It, Orzhov, and Dimir, which I think are just finicky and tricky to draft, tricky to build, but not necessarily just straight bad. I think they just need some working out, need some time to develop, need some time for people to figure out what they're supposed to be doing with the decks. I think those win rates are going to come up to something a little closer to 53, 54, narrowing that range even more. So yeah, this is just to say that as you're drafting, I wouldn't shy away from particular colors all that much, or particular archetypes all that much. I'm going to touch on It and Orzhov and Dimir, those bottom 3 decks, as we get into talking about the archetypes, talk about why I think they're a little bit finicky, and what you can do if right now you want to be drafting these decks, what you need to be able to make those decks a thing. But yeah, a lot of early indicators of this is a fairly balanced format. Okay, the next big picture point I want to cover is just talking about removal, talking about how much you want to value it in this set, and that is kind of it, how much you want to value it in this set. I feel the same way about removal in Duskmourn as I have about basically the last year of sets, kind of in the play booster era, where I feel like you're kind of unequipped to play the games if you don't have somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4, 5, 6 removal spells. And if you've heard my State of the Format addresses in the past little while, this is something that's going to sound familiar. And I think it's kind of a symptom of the play booster era, to be honest, with just more rares running around, just more must-answer cards. Thankfully, I do think they've done a pretty good job of making the rares manageable to some extent, as in there are rares that will win the game if they go unanswered, but if you do answer them, it's not the end of the world. There's been rares in previous formats. I'm thinking Crimson Vow was a really good example of this, where it didn't matter if you had the removal spell when they played their rare. It was just like, oh, they had a Dreadfeast Demon, and they made another Dreadfeast Demon, and I didn't have a chance to kill it. Or they had Everbruck Caretaker, which literally just has hexproof. I think the rares in this set, and of a few previous sets too, kind of fall under the category of, yeah, they'll get a little bit of value when this enters, or, this thing's going to kill you really quickly if you don't answer it. But if you do answer these cards, they're manageable. Think of the Avatar Impending cycle in this set. Most of these cards, like, for example, the blue one, comes in, they draw 2 and discard a card, so they're up a card, but if you kill it, Okay, that's totally fine. Entity Tracker, here's another example. It's the 2 and a blue 2/3 flash that when you cast an enchantment or unlock a room, you draw a card. Yeah, they're likely going to draw a card or two off of this. They're up a few cards, but the game continues. So really, I once again, I'm aiming for, at a very minimum, 4 removal spells. Somewhere in the range of 5 or 6, I think, is a bit better. And really, to hammer this home, if you just look at the list of top commons in this set, a lot of them are removal spells. Like, the number 1 performing common right now is Trapped in the Screen, which is the 2 and a white enchantment that comes in, exiles an artifact, enchantment, or creature until this leaves, and it has ward 2. A little bit of built-in protection is definitely nice, but this is the top common right now. Also, just their standard Scorching Dragonfire, Murder. These are all pretty good cards, and where in previous years, I was kind of the mind that, especially in your aggro decks, you didn't really need removal spells. You kind of get by with tricks, and that's true to some extent still. You don't need, 7 removal spells in your aggro deck, but I do feel like you need 4 or 5 just to make sure you can deal with those must-answer bombs that, we're not talking 7 mana bombs that you can kill them before they matter. We're talking 3, 4, 5 mana bombs that are going to be part of the game, even if you're playing like a red-white aggro deck. You're still going to face them. You're still going to have to answer them to get through them. And so if I'm in pack 3 and I'm like, I only got 2 removal spells, I will happily take something like Impossible Inferno, which is the 5 mana red instant deal 6, and if you have Delirium, you get to exile a card, you can cast that until the end of your next turn. This is actually a lot better than the 5 mana deal 6s we usually see. Still not an amazing card, still costs 5, but it is a card I am happy to play if I haven't met that quota of 4 to 5 removal spells. And then lastly, before we get into some archetype thoughts, I think that the artifact and enchantment removal is very playable in the set and very main deckable. So we're looking at cards like Exercise, 1 and a white sorcery at uncommon. You exile an artifact, enchantment, or creature power for or greater, or Break Down the Door. This is 2 and a green for an instant at uncommon. You choose one. You either exile target artifact, exile target enchantment, or Manifest Dread. Nice that both these cards have a buyout mode. Of course, Break Down the Door, manifesting if they literally don't have an artifact or enchantment, or Exercise, probably going to be able to nab a creature at some point, a non-artifact, non-enchantment creature that has power 4 or greater. But what makes these main deckable is the set is just so filled with artifact creatures, enchantment creatures, rooms, artifacts that you might want to blow up, equipment. There are so many targets in basically every deck. I am happy to play the first one. In fact, I'm probably actively looking for the first copy of these kind of cards, and I don't mind playing the second either. I think once you get to 3, especially if it is something that just says destroy target artifact or enchantment without a buyout mode, that's when I'm like, okay, you might want to cut down there. But the first one for sure, the second one probably, like the first one I'm looking for actively, and the second one is fine to play. And there's going to be some matchups where these are just, removal spells for the majority of their cards. You can play against a blue-white Eerie deck, Exercise is going to be fantastic against them. And just before we talk about some archetypes, do you want to call out the Patreon? Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. If you're enjoying the show and you want to see more, if you want to see the show succeed, you want me to be in your ears, your eyes? If you want to listen to me talk about limited magic a little bit more, do check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. There's also a Discord associated, bit.ly/join the Discord. Discord spelled with a CH like Quarter Calls. Also in the description of the podcast feed and the YouTube video, if you want just a nice clickable link. The Patreon not only supports the show, but also offers a bunch of rewards over there that all help you get better at limited magic. They range from coaching benefits to deck tech and draft log review help, a lot of stuff in between too. So if you're interested in helping out the show, or you're interested in getting a little bit better and taking that extra step, do check that out, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. All right, archetype time. So I'm going to be talking about the top decks in the format today. As per usual, I go into the lesser decks, the more niche decks. As the format goes on, it develops more. These top decks aren't as easily draftable, but for now, it's good to know about the decks you want to get into when not everybody knows what the best decks are. So we're going to start with blue-white, which I do think, like the stats say, and my feeling too, is the best deck in the format right now. And blue-white's not exactly an aggro deck, not exactly a tempo deck. Like, I don't think it quite falls under those, but it's definitely getting on board first, and then interacting / playing things to help your creatures get through, rather than how a control deck would play, which is like, cast a bunch of removal spells, then win with a bunch of card advantage or a big threat. I think it has some elements of that. It can grind pretty well. Rooms are really good mana sinks, help you keep up in the late game, help you grind with an opponent that might be a little more grindy. But I think first and foremost, you're looking to kill the opponent. You're looking to get on board. You're looking to cast things that trigger your eerie payoffs. Those eerie payoffs generally are going to be things that help you attack better, help you get on board, make creatures. So that's what we're looking at here. I do think there are builds that are a bit more control-centric, but just not the default. Let's talk about the gold cards first, and the best one out of the two, remember every deck gets 2 signposts this time around, is Gremlin Tamer, and this card is just an absolute house. This is blue-white for a 2/2, and the eerie ability here, whenever an enchantment you control enters or whenever you fully unlock a room, you make a 1/1 Gremlin token. Really not hard to fill your deck with 10, 11, 12 enchantments, so this thing triggers quite often. And then the other one is not as good, but still quite good, Inquisitive Glimmer. This is blue-white for an enchantment creature. It's a 2/3, and it says your enchantments cost 1 less and unlock costs of rooms cost 1 less. So a nice little support card, definitely an appreciated card, but Gremlin Tamer, I think, definitely steals the show out of the two. I think this card is definitely first pickable. You could just take this and see if blue-white's open, but that's not all blue-white has. Blue-white's got a lot of great support. So I want to call your attention to 4 premium uncommons for this deck. One of them is just like fantastic, one of the best uncommons in the set, if not the best uncommon. The other 3 are a little more deck specific, but also amazing in this deck. So we'll talk about the generically good one first. Sheltered by Ghosts. This is 1 and a white for an aura. It's an uncommon. Enchants a creature you control. When it enters, exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls until Sheltered by Ghosts leaves the battlefield. The enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has lifelink and ward 2. So just a massive tempo swing with this thing. Get rid of a thing, you get lifelink, your creature's harder to deal with. Ideally, you're putting this on an evasive creature, a flyer, so that you can keep getting your creature into combat. You know, you don't really want to put it on a ground creature as much. So a really, really fantastic card. And just below that, I would say, is Optimistic Scavenger, a card that is so good that the first time I read it, I misread it because I was kind of skimming it. I was like, oh, you know, it can't be that good. And then when I actually read it correctly, I was like, oh, no, this card is busted. This is a single white mana for a 1/1. It has Eerie, and the Eerie trigger is you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. If you played Neon Dynasty, you might remember Generous Visitor, which was kind of a green version of this. You put a counter on something when you cast an enchantment, but this is even better because, number one, it's easier to trigger this card. Not only are there more enchantments in the set, but of course, you know, rooms counting too. You get kind of 2 counters from each of your rooms. And this card is just such a snowbally card, really phenomenal card. Fear of Isolation. This one's a little bit less obvious, but also really, really strong. So this is 1 and a blue for a 2/3 enchantment creature. It's got flying, and it says an additional cost to cast this spell. Return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. What's great about this card is, well, it's a 2 mana 2/3 flyer. That's pretty good. Obviously, it's got a bit of a downside, but that downside is often an upside because you can pick up a creature that has a Unable to Scream or a Stay Hidden, Stay Silent on it. These are both enchantment-based removal spells. So you can pick something up that got locked down, or you can pick up one of your many enchantments with your rooms, reuse those. Pick up any creature with a good enter the battlefield effect. You could pick up your Sheltered by Ghosts and reset that. Exile something that's a little more of a pressing threat that has come down since the last time you cast Sheltered by Ghosts. You could pick up a land if you really, really needed to. I wouldn't suggest casting this on turn 2 almost ever, but, you know, you can pick up a land if there's nothing great to pick up, which then leads into the fact that you can do that trick where anything that allows you to pick up a land means that if you are missing your land drop for your turn, you can cast this, let's say on turn 3, and you pick up a land, you play this and another 2-drop, so it kind of generates a mana virtually. So really flexible, really efficient card. When you cast this and you pick up an enchantment, it's basically 2 Eerie triggers. It also lets you pick up your manifested card, so if you manifest a good non-creature spell, you can pick that up and cast it. So very versatile, very flexible, very synergistic with what's going on here. And the last uncommon that I really want to bring attention to is Ethereal Armor. And the last card here, Ethereal Armor. This one's a reprint from when I started playing, actually, Return to Ravnica. This is a single mana for an aura. The enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and has First Strike. So in this deck, this is often 1 mana, +4/+4, 5/5. You know, yesterday I was playing this deck and I had my Ethereal Armor be +10/+10. I just slapped that on my flyer and killed them right away. And I think blue-white performing as well as it is partially because these uncommons are so strong. This deck gets so many good uncommons. But of course, it's not all about the uncommons. Let's move to some other cards here. So 2 commons I want to call out are Glimmer Burst and Glimmer Light, the 2 Glimmer twins here. Glimmer Burst being the 4 mana blue instant that draws 2 cards and creates a 1/1 enchantment creature token, and Glimmer Light, 2 mana equipment. Talked about this one a few minutes ago. 2 mana equipment comes in, makes an enchantment creature. The equipped creature gets +1/+1, and you equip for a single mana. And this is a card that looks like a lot of bad cards in the past. Why I think it's kind of being overlooked right now. You know, a lot of junky-ish 2 to 3 mana common equipment that aren't very good. But this is a very different card, right? Coming with a body, having synergy with Delirium, or of course in this deck with the enchantment creature stuff. You're making tokens with your Gremlin Tamer that can turn into 2/2s. That's pretty relevant. So a card that I would not mind playing multiple in my blue-white decks. Glimmer Burst 2 being a little bit underrated. This is one of the better commons in the set. And it does look like a lot of cards we've seen in the past, where it's just like, all right, expensive-ish 4 mana, draw 2 with a little bit of upside, but that 1/1 is huge upside. It looks like small upside, but it's huge upside. Not just for triggering your eerie things, but, you know, you can equip this, you can start putting counters on it, you can chump block with this. So if you are a little bit behind, just casting 4 mana, draw 2, kind of virtually gain 4 life if you chump block, like that's a big deal. So happy to play maybe 2 or 3 copies of this in a lot of blue-white decks. The cheaper your deck is, like the lower your mana curve, the happier I am to have this as sort of your top end. The more expensive stuff you have, the less card draw you generally want, because you're going to be spending mana on those expensive spells. You don't really have all that much time to just be drawing cards, and you have places to put your mana. But if your deck is full of, you know, all those uncommons I just listed, all those 1 and 2 mana uncommons, which by the way, I didn't call that out, but all those excellent uncommons are so cheap, so efficient. The more of those you have, the more I'm going to want Glimmer Burst. Also notice that this deck gets a lot of synergistic removal. So we've got Unable to Scream, which is a single blue mana aura. The enchanted creature is an 0/2 and loses all abilities, and as long as the enchanted creature is face down, can't be turned face up. And this kind of card generally don't like very much, right? The turn your creature into a worse creature. But this one hits on all the things that do make these cards good. Number 1, well, let's look at the mana cost. It's only 1 mana. You know, can't get any better than that. But number 2, it makes it a 0 power creature, which means that it's not going to peck in for a damage. You can't team up on a double block somewhere, right? Being an 0/2 is so much less bad for you casting this card than Witness Protection. If you play with that card back in Streets and you Capenna, that card made the creature a 1/1 and was not very good. But also, removing all abilities, sometimes these auras, these blue auras, don't remove all abilities, and that's another huge part of the puzzle here. The creatures can't be flipped up. That, you know, I actually didn't even know, to be honest, that had that line of text until I read it right out when I was reading this here. Completely forgot about that. I don't think it's ever come up in a game of mine. But, you know, a little bit of a relevant bump there. So it does still have the issue of, you know, this can be disenchanted. Your opponent can pick up their creature that's been, you know, enchanted with this thing. So it's got some of the downsides that these kind of cards have, but makes up for it in a lot of ways. So I'd be happy playing a copy or 2 of that. Trapped into Screen, of course, the Oblivion Ring white enchantment removal spell comes in, exiles an artifact, creature, or enchantment until this leaves. That card's just, you know, a good card. And then Stay Hidden, Stay Silent. This is a standout card at Uncommon too. 1 and a blue for an aura. You tap the enchanted creature. When this comes in, it stays tapped. And you can pay 6 mana to shuffle Stay Hidden, Stay Silent and the enchanted creature into their owner's decks, and you get to manifest Dread. And then let's talk about some rooms. So one card that excels in this deck, and I think is kind of mediocre anywhere else, is Grand Entryway / Elegant Rotunda. This is the 2 mana, 1 and a white room. Grand Entryway is the 1 and a white room that when you unlock the door, you get a 1/1 Glimmer enchantment creature token, and Elegant Rotunda is 3 mana, 2 and a white. When you unlock this room, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. So most rooms, they trigger Eerie twice, right? Once when you cast it the first time, second time when you unlock the other door. This one triggers Eerie 3 times, because when you cast Grand Entryway, the room's going to trigger it, and the 1/1 Glimmer creature, that's going to trigger it too. And I say this is just a blue-white card, because I think all the other white decks generally just want to be playing a 2-powered creature on turn 2, you know, green-white and red-white. They want to be attacking. They don't want to spend time and mana making your 2-drop into a 2/2. They don't appreciate the enchantment side of things as much as blue-white would at all, of course. I think that black-white can play this card, and it'll be pretty good there too. Not so much black-white Reanimator, more like a black-white Eerie deck. But yeah, this is one of the best commons for blue-white. That triple Eerie thing really mattering. Then we've got another common here, Underwater Tunnel, which is the single blue mana when you unlock this room, Surveil 2, and then Slimy Aquarium, 4 mana when you unlock this door, and Manifest Dread, and then put a +1/+1 counter on it. Totally fun role player. You know, nothing I'm like actively looking for in this deck, but you know, you can play it as a filler card. And then one card that I think is actually a little bit of a trap in blue-white, Meat Locker / Drowned Diner. This is the 3 mana, unlock this door, put a stun counter on one target creature. Sorry, 2 stun counters. Tap it and put 2 stun counters. And Drowned Diner is 5 mana, draw 3, and then discard a card. While Meat Locker is like an okay way to interact, I don't think blue-white is generally looking for like a big draw spell, because so many of its creatures just generate value, right? You don't need a card that's just 5 mana raw draw spell. It doesn't generate a token like the common draw 2 does, and that's a big deal, like I said. So you're kind of looking at 2 cards that blue-white doesn't really want that much. And again, like, you might look at this card and be like, oh, the tempo side of Meat Locker looks pretty good, but generally these effects that are like, tap a thing, keep it tapped down for 3 turns, have not played out very well. Yes, it is an enchantment. Yes, it is a room. Makes it slightly better than these kind of cards usually are. But I do think that people are overplaying this card a little bit in blue-white. It's a good slower deck card, like in a blue-red room deck or maybe a blue-black control deck. But I think it's just a little bit too clunky on both sides for blue-white. And then 2 uncommons, just to cap off blue-white here, that are really strong. Both uncommon rooms are Bottomless Pool. This is a single blue mana bounce spell room, and the other side is Locker Room, 5 mana for an enchantment. This is when one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. That single mana bounce spell that is also an enchantment, just great. Just fantastic. You can bounce your own creatures, right? Bounce your own things, re-trigger things, but most of the time you're just gonna, bounce your opponent's 4/4, and that'll enable a big attack. And then if the game goes on long, the Locker Room can start generating value. And Surgical Sweep, the other fantastic one here. So this is 2 mana for an enchantment. When you unlock this door, reanimate a creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And that's the big part of this card. And we see this kind of reanimate a small thing in white a lot of the time for 2 mana. But being an enchantment makes it a lot better. And what I mentioned a few minutes ago is that all of the super premium cards for this deck are cheap cards, right? There are 1 and 2 mana cards, a few 3 mana cards I didn't really touch on, but just being able to reuse those, buy those back, really fantastic. The other side, Hospital Room, 4 mana. Whenever you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on a target attacking creature. That's fine too, 5 mana sink, but really Surgical Sweep to buy back your awesome cards is really what you're looking for. So yeah, blue-white, great deck. I imagine that as the days go on, it's going to be harder to draft, so get your reps in now while you can, because I think it's going to be eaten up pretty quickly once people figure out that this is a really good deck. Okay, now an adjacent deck to blue-white, talking about red-white, which is the next best performing deck in the format. Red-white often is a out of the gates, early in the format, one of the decks that performs really well in most formats, as long as the red-white deck is functional. Sometimes it's not, but this deck is definitely functional. It's got a few really, really amazing cards. The 2 gold cards, if you add these 2 cards, like, they're powered together, might be the best of the 10 color pairs. Like, there is definitely other signposts that are individually better, but the second signpost of the color isn't as good. These 2 signposts are both excellent. So we've got Arabella, Abandoned Doll, red-white for a 1/3 artifact creature, also a toy that matters once in a while. When it attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. So this card is very, very similar to a card we had last set, Valley Rockcaller, the black 1/3 rare that drained for your, like lizards, squirrels, all the creature types that touch black, basically. This card is very, very similar, but I think is even easier to trigger because you just need small creatures, and that's what you're going to have in your aggro deck anyways. And the other one here, Midnight Mayhem. This is 2 red-white for a sorcery. Create 3 1/1 gremlin creature tokens. Gremlins you control gain Menace, Lifelink, and Haste on turn. Awesome card. Just lifelink, great. Menace, great. Hate, all the words in this card are great. Don't exactly have to spell it out. Also note that there are a few gremlins in the set that will give lifelink and menace to. Don't just think it's the 3/1/1s. Sometimes you do give your, there's like a reverent gremlin, the 2 mana 2/2 menace that lets you rummage. That's a gremlin too, of course. So yeah, just like the blue-white uncommon gremlin tamer, I'm happy to take these cards early and be like, all right, let's ride these, see if red-white's open, because they are both phenomenal. And then another thing that makes this deck really strong, and often a feature of what will make a red-white aggro deck very strong, is the combat tricks you get access to are great. There's a red trick and a white trick I really like, and they're both 1 mana. The one that I like the most, though, is Turn Inside Out. This is the red one. 1 red mana instant. Target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn. When it dies this turn, manifest Dread. So lets your small creatures trade up, lets you get in for the last 3 points of damage. Trading up and then manifesting Dread, like that's generally going to be pretty good for your 1 mana. And then Jump Scare, another really efficient trick. Usually we get this effect for 2 mana, but it's a 1 mana card. 1 white mana for an instant. Until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+2, gains flying, and becomes a horror enchantment creature in addition to its other types. Mostly a downside, actually, that last part, because if you turn into an enchantment creature, you can get gotten by instant speed enchantment removal, but, you know, whatever, a little bit of flavor. It doesn't hurt the card too much. The +2/+2 in flying is obviously what you care about the most here, so I'd be happy playing multiple copies of those cards. And the other side of things, you want to make sure your creature suite is good. So Clockwork Percussionist. This is a single red mana for a 1/1. It's an artifact creature. It's got haste. When it dies, you exile the top card of your library. You can play that card until end of turn. This is just a good red card, I think. Like, basically in every red deck, like your red Delirium decks, your red-white decks, your red-black decks for sacrificing. It's not a red-blue card, but this is just a good card, like just a good red card, and does excel in this deck. Vicious Clown is a card that I've actually come up on. I started sort of low on it, but I've come around on it being pretty good. This is the 3 mana 2/3 in red. Whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less enters, the clown gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And I like it specifically if you've got copies of Jump Scare, because it's not too difficult to engineer a situation where you like cast 2 cheap creatures in a turn, then cast Jump Scare. You've jumped your clown. It's now like an 8 power creature because of the Jump Scare, so just dealing the last 8 points of damage is really nice. And then 2 common 4-drops that conveniently have 2 power. Most 4 power creatures don't have 2 power, and if they did, I'd be like, well, that's not very good. But they have effects that make up for it. So Most Valuable Slayer, 3 and a red for a 2/4. Whenever you attack, not when this attack, when you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. This is a card that I've actually been on a bit of a roller coaster on, because I started in the set review. We actually rated it pretty low. You know, it was like a C- level card. And then I realized, oh wait, this is just Combat Professor. This card is excellent. And then the stats came out, it said it's not as good as I thought it was, not quite Combat Professor level. And I maybe was like, oh, maybe I was a little bit too high on it. But the more I play with it, the more I like it still. And I can't exactly explain why the stats don't like it. Maybe just because, you know, it's an expensive card in an aggro deck. That could certainly be it. But I am looking for a few good 4-drops in my aggro deck. And yeah, I think this one definitely passed the bar for good. So helps the Vicious Clown attack, you know, for example, helps most of your small creatures attack. But the combo I really like, and this involves an uncommon, but Fear of Being Hunted. This is 2 red for a 4/2 enchantment creature with haste, and it has to be blocked if able. So you got a 5 power first striker that has to be blocked. If your opponent can't break that up, they're not winning combat. They're having their creatures eaten every single turn. So, you know, that's a nice little combo, but I do just think it's good at enabling attacks in general. And then Friendly Ghost, the other 4 mana creature here, 3 and a white for a 2/4 flyer. When it enters, target creature gets +2/+4 until end of turn. Just a gigantic boost. Well, it will really make any creature that you've played before be able to attack on turn 4. And then a few uncommons I want to call out. Split Skin Doll. This is 1 and a white for a 2/1 artifact creature. When it enters, you draw a card, and then you discard a card unless you control another creature power 2 or less. So just a good card, you know, and it's not exactly the most aggressive card, but it's just a good card. And Razorkin Horde Caller. This is 5 mana for a 4/4 haste, and whenever you attack, not when this attacks, you make a 1/1 Gremlin creature token. So for those who have played Lord of the Rings, you'll remember Éomer. This card is different, not exactly worse, not exactly better, just a bit different. It's not legendary. It doesn't have a 5th point of power, but this doesn't have to attack. You don't have to engage this in combat if you don't want to. You get your 1/1s. So it's a very comparable card, and that card was fantastic. One trap I want to call out that I've seen people try to play in a lot of their red-white decks and just is not a good card. Living Phone. This is 2 and a white for a 2/1 artifact creature. When it dies, you look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with power 2 or less from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This card kind of just perplexes me. It kind of says it belongs in a red-white deck, because, you know, all the toys, that's kind of the hint that the designers put forth, just like, oh, the toys, they go in the red-white deck. But this card is not what an aggro deck wants. You don't want a 2 power 3 mana creature. You don't want to, a 3-mana 2/1. A death trigger instead of an enter the battlefield trigger really is a lot worse. This could also just miss. Like, it's not guaranteed you hit anything. So I would really suggest just not playing this card. I could maybe see this in a slower white deck, but it's not a red-white card for sure. And so yeah, that's what's going on with red-white. Not too complicated, honestly. I guess one more thing is that all of the eerie enchantment stuff going on in white, like, that can be a sub-theme of your red-white deck. It doesn't have to be exactly a blue-white deck. Like, the premium white uncommons that I mentioned for blue-white, like Sheltered by Ghosts and the Opportunist, the one that puts counters on things, Ethereal Armor even, like, those are good cards in this deck as long as you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of, 9, 10 enchantments, which isn't that difficult because a lot of the white cards do provide you with that, and some of the red cards too. So yeah, you can port some of that white stuff we talked about from the last archetype to this one. But aside from that, it's a pretty standard aggro deck. There's nothing too complicated going on. And just like blue-white, I would say get your reps in with this deck while you can. Draft your Arabellas and your Midnight Mayhems, because I think people are going to catch on pretty quick. Next up is the deck that I've actually drafted the most and had the most success with, blue-green. Blue-green Manifest Dread. So just like the last two decks we looked at, blue-green has a busted uncommon. And I think this is probably the best signpost uncommon in the set, Oblivious Bookworm. Blue-green for a 2/3. At the beginning of your end step, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card unless a permanent entered the battlefield under your control this turn, or you turned a permanent face up. This card kind of just like baffles me at how many knobs were turned in the way that they're like, yeah, we should probably push this. Maybe it's just R&D truly trying to redeem blue-green in the year of 2024. But having a 3rd point of toughness, this thing just sitting around and looting, even if you don't have any manifest creatures entering the battlefield, that helps with delirium if you have some delirium cards, just putting cards in your graveyard, but also like triggering off of entering and flipping. It's just, yeah, just so many things that they push on this card, and it is fantastic. It's one of the top uncommons in the set. I said it for some of the previous gold cards, but I'll say it for this one too. I do think this card is first pickable, and yeah, I have splashed it once in a while. I don't generally think it's great to splash. It is a card you kind of want to play a little bit earlier in the game, but it wouldn't be the worst if you're just like, hey, I need a little bit of a boost in power. Like, I have splashed it myself. And then the other gold uncommon, it's a good card too, Growing Dread. Good card, but in the shadow of Oblivious Bookworm for sure. So Growing Dread is a green-blue enchantment with flash. When it enters, you manifest Dread, and whenever a permanent is turned face up, you put a +1/+1 counter on that permanent. So yeah, really good card. I think that this deck is pretty straightforward, honestly. A lot of the cards that say manifest Dread, or when you manifest Dread, do a thing, that's what you're looking for here. A lot of those cards just work. And I think that that's a theme that we've seen for the decks we've looked at. Like, this just works. There's not really many traps. So just to call out a few great uncommons. Two of the best ones are sorceries that manifest Dread. We've got Under the Skin, which is 2 and a green for a sorcery. You manifest Dread, and then you may return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. Notably, this card is worded in such a way that you don't target on cast. So what you can do, and because Magic cards resolve with the order that their text box is in, you manifest Dread, you look at the top 2, put one on the battlefield, put one on the grave, and you can just grab that permanent card if it's the only permanent in your grave with this card. So you could just cast this on turn 3, nothing in your graveyard, and be like, yeah, I'll just cast my manifest Dread card. Maybe you have a Bookworm on turn 2 into this, you draw a card, and you also draw the card that you just put in the graveyard. As long as your deck is, permanent heavy enough, which these blue-green decks tend to be fairly permanent heavy. The other kind of sister version of this card is Unnerving Grasp, 2 and a blue for a sorcery, an uncommon once again. Return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, then you manifest Dread. This is probably like the best mana war they've ever printed. It targets non-land permanents, not just creatures. It can target your own stuff. You can pick up a room that you fully unlocked and use its effects, use those again. You can target a manifest creature that, you want to pick up for an enter the battlefield effect, or if you've manifested a non-creature spell, getting to cast that. Just a great card. Really, really, really great card. And then a few other uncommons here, too, that support this deck. Threats around every corner. This is a 4-mana enchantment in green. When it enters, you manifest Dread, and whenever a face-down permanent you control enters, you search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. And Paranormal Analyst, which is a 2-mana, 1 and a blue, 1/3, that basically, whenever you manifest Dread, the card you don't choose, you put that card into your hand. You get to draw it. Some commons to talk about. Once again, it kind of, if it says Manifest Dread on it, it's probably going to be good in this deck. The actual card, Manifest Dread, yeah, totally good card in this deck. Well, 1 and a green, Manifest Dread. But one that might surprise you, I've really liked, is Reality Twist. So this is 1 blue, blue. Instant, choose one, either counter target spell or Manifest Dread. Cancel variants tend to be either just below playable or just above, just above average into the playable range. And this one is firmly in the playable range. That flexibility of having this counterspell up and passing the turn and manifesting if they don't do anything or nothing worth countering, or just, you draw this in the late game and you're trying to be proactive. You don't want to just be like, okay, well, I could run a counterspell, I can counter their next thing. Instead, you just cast that, trigger your Brookworm, trigger your Paranormal Analyst. Like, just that flexibility, the modality of that makes it a really strong card. I would play, 2-3 copies of this pretty happily. One blue, a little bit tricky. You want to make sure that maybe blue is a base color if you're playing multiple copies. But yeah, a card that I think is pretty underrated right now. Another one, actually, that falls into that camp of kind of underrated is Bashful Beastie. This is the 4 and a green 5/4. When it dies, Manifest Dread. Kind of just looks like a big, clunky 5-mana creature, but that death trigger is pretty good, and it's one of the better things to manifest into, right? Just a big creature. One of the things deck building wise with these decks you want to consider is having some number of largish creatures to Manifest Dread into. I don't think it's a huge consideration, but just having, one of these beasties, a few of these beasties, or there's the 7-mana Land Cycler, the 7/6 Trampler. I don't actually think it's all that important to be able to flip your manifest into a big threat. That's actually one of the more common questions I've gotten this week is like, how much do you care about flipping your manifest, or how often do you do it? The answer is not that often, honestly. It's really just like, well, you're manifesting Dread, you're making it 2/2, which triggers all your Manifest Dread payoffs, and that's kind of just good enough. Like, yes, once in a while, if you can get one over in your opponent and they block your 2/2 with their 2/2 and you get to flip it up into a 4/4, yeah, that's nice, but I wouldn't go out of my way to really fill my deck with big creatures because, like, that's just not a key component of what makes this deck tick. Well, maybe it changes my evaluation to where I would have played 0 large dummies to maybe 2 or 3, but I want those large dummies to still be good cards, like Bashful Beastie. So just wanted to call it that kind of small little intricacy of deck building there. And one other small intricacy of deck building is, well, blue-green is a color pair in this set that is pretty well suited to splash, a lot of card selection. You're playing a slower game. There's a lot of fixing in the set. You do have to be worried about the fact that if you're splashing off of a single basic land and you're planning to go get that basic land with a Terramorphic Expanse, your threats around every corner, maybe a Spineseeker Centipede, which is a 2 in the green 2/1 that ETBs and goes and gets a land. Problem there is if you ever Manifest Dread into that land, or let's just say you're splashing a black card into that swamp you're playing, and you don't have a way to get it back, well, that Spineseeker Centipede, that Terramorphic Expanse, no longer go and get a black source. So if you get unlucky and hit that one swamp in your deck, well, all your other fixing won't fix you anymore. The solve to this is generally to pick up dual lands. You don't want to just be relying on the basic. I wouldn't generally recommend playing multiple basics to solve that problem. It is a solution I have enacted in some decks where I felt like playing a secondary basic of my splash color wasn't just like a terrible idea. Like this, I'm talking about in a deck with no double pips, a lot of card selection, because anytime you add a second basic of your splash, that messes with your mana base a lot. So again, I wouldn't count it at 100%, but I also wouldn't super recommend it. And then one more piece of the puzzle here. So blue-green has a bit of a decking problem. It definitely sees most of its cards almost every game. If you've got a lot of Manifest Dread, other self-mill, there's a card, Say Its Name, that we're going to touch on in a few minutes, that, look at the top 3, put those 3 in the grave, get to rebuy a card from your yard, like that. You're churning through your deck pretty quickly. Maybe you have Glimmer Burst to draw 2, make an enchantment creature token, like that card. You see a lot of cards, and I have had a lot of games already where I've decked or come very, very close to decking, or I've killed my opponent because they couldn't kill me in time before they decked. So if you are in that neighborhood of, I don't know, I'd say 8-9 cards that either Manifest Dread or Self-Mill, I'd be looking to include a copy of Malevolent Chandelier. This is the 6-mana 4/4 artifact creature with flying. You can pay 2 mana to put a card on the bottom of its owner's library, activate only as a sorcery. Really just channeling your inner Sam Black here. I do think that this is something you're looking for in these decks. And there's another effect that does a similar thing, Cathartic Parting. This is 1 and a green for a sorcery. The owner of target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls shuffles into the library, and then you can take 4 cards from your grave and shuffle those into your library. So kind of does a similar thing. The Chandelier is a bit more reliable because, you know, you might still deck if you're just putting 4 cards back. But yeah, this is an effect that I do try to find a card slot for. Okay, and then the last space we're going to talk about here is Delirium. And there's 2 flavors of Delirium. There's red-green, which is a bit more aggressive, black-green, which tends to be a bit more grindy, controlling. I've had red-green decks that were not that aggressive, maybe had more green cards than red cards, kind of, or just playing a more mid-rangey, grindy game. I've also had black-green decks that, you know, could play the beatdown role pretty well. So, you know, do keep that in mind. Don't think like, oh, I'm red-green, I have to be aggressive, or I'm black-green, I have to be controlling. That's just naturally where they lie. But like I said at the beginning, it is up to you as the drafter to build your own deck and see what your deck wants, see what your deck needs. Don't get too caught in exactly what, you know, the WotC suggested color pairs are. Let's talk about red-green first. Red-green has a phenomenal 2-drop here, as one of its signpost uncommons. Wildfire Wickerfolk is a red-green 3/2 haste. It's an artifact creature, and it gets +1/+1. It has trample as long as there are 4 or more card types in your graveyard. Just a phenomenal 2-drop. So often this thing's gonna get in 3 points for free. You know, you're on the play, you send this in, maybe your opponent misses their 2-drop, and you get in 6 points, and that's, you know, you're feeling great about yourself at that point. But honestly, even if this just trades for a removal spell or your opponent's opposing 2-drop, like, you're halfway to Delirium with this card alone. Super strong card. We've got a removal spell as the other gold card here, Beastie Beatdown. This is red-green for a sorcery that is one of the worst templating nightmares I've seen in a while. It just seems like, I'm sure they have to template it this way, but it just is so many words for a pretty simple effect. I'll just say what the card does rather than reading it out. It punches an opponent's creature. Targets something you control, targets something they control. Your thing punches theirs, but if you have Delirium, you put 2+1/+1 counters on your creature first, so just enables really, really big swings in combat. Then the black-green side of things, Brood Spinner. This is black-green for a 2/3 reach. When it enters, Surveil 2. So already great, right? Just like 2/3 reach, Surveil 2. I'd be happy with that as a Delirium enabler, early blocker, but also has the ability for black-green, tap sack the Brood Spinner, create a number of 1/1 insect tokens with flying. That's an important part. A lot of people miss that reading this card. Equal the number of card types in your graveyard. And then, just like red-green, black-green's other signpost is a removal spell. Drag from the roots to black-green for an instant, destroy target non-land permanent, and if you have Delirium, it only costs black-green. So, across the board, most of these signposts are just really good cards. And I could actually say that about most of the signposts in this set. Just, you know, I think they did a really good job of making these enticing, appealing cards. But yeah, definitely these 4 are very good. But past that, what are you looking for? So like I mentioned in the intro, I think it's pretty easy to enable Delirium in this set. Just so many of the cards and so many of the mechanics push towards that. I do think that it's worth considering your card types as you're drafting, as you're building, making sure, you know, creature, instant, and sorcery, those are generally pretty easy. Although sometimes instant can be actually a little bit hard, I found. There's not like all that many green-red instants. I mean, Scorching Dragonfire in red, and there's the 1-mana Trick, Turn Inside Out in red. Those are instants, but instant is actually a card type that isn't just free. But those are the 3 that go to the graveyard naturally. Then you want to make sure you've got enough artifacts. Artifact creatures help, enchantment creatures help, of course. Terramorphic Expanse is a really, really big priority for these decks, just being able to get a land that fetches and, you know, puts itself in the graveyard. And then just so many of the spells help you get cards in the graveyard. So all the Manifest Dread cards, like those are just all great in this deck. I talked about all the Manifest Dread cards in blue-green, and all of those cards, at least the green ones that you can play, those are cards I'd be happy to play in these decks too. But stuff like Wary Watchdog, this is the 2-mana 3/1 in green that when it enters or dies, Surveil 1. That's another card that I'm happy to play in either version of these decks. And I think the actual best enabler for Delirium is Say Its Name. This is 1 and a green for a sorcery at common. Mill 3 cards, and then you can return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. A lot of other text on this card that we're going to get to in a second, but just that alone is really good. And this is a card that I'm sure is going to start going a lot earlier once people figure out just how good it is at enabling Delirium, but it's also just like a functional fine magic card, right? Just a little bit of filtering. Something that's easy to overlook is you don't take a card from the 3 milled, you take any card from your graveyard, or sorry, any creature or land card from your graveyard, so that adds to it. But being a sorcery that then mills 3 cards, I've had Delirium enabled on turn 2 with this plus Terramorphic Expanse, or even just this milling an artifact creature and a land, right? Like, that's Delirium right there. But of course, if you know this card at all, it's also got some additional text. So you can exile 3 copies of Say Its Name from your graveyard to summon Altanak, the Thrice Called, which is a 7-mana 9/9 trample legendary creature that, when it becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you draw a card, so just this big, gigantic dummy that has a little bit of resiliency. Also has an ability, 1 and a green, discard it from your hand, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tap. A little bit of a buyout mode. I think this card is playable in any green deck. It's not a priority. It's a solid card, but nothing I'm like, oh man, like that card's awesome. But if you do have 3 Say Its Name, that adds a whole other dimension to your deck. And I'm very, very happy with that. I've already seen a lot of screenshots, by the way, of turn 2 Ultinac, where somebody casts Say Its Name and mills, 2 more. I've seen a screenshot of somebody with 8 copies of Say Its Name, which I think just is a testament to the fact that it is a little bit underrated right now, going under the radar. But yeah, I think this is just one of the best cards for the Delirium deck. You really, really want Say Its Name in either version of the deck. Probably a little bit more in the black-green version than the red-green version if you're aggressive, because you can't spend all the time in the world just casting a thing that doesn't affect the board. But, first copy or 2 in red-green, still going to be fantastic. Some other cards to call out here. I want to call out Patchwork Beastie as one of the best enablers for this deck, too. Single green mana for a 3/3 artifact creature. When you have Delirium, it can attack or block. It can't normally, but when you have Delirium, it can. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may mill a card. So you've got this thing that kind of just sits there and mills you, enables Delirium, and then wakes up on turn, 3 or 4 or 5. Another one that's fantastic, Fear of Burning Alive. This is 4 red for a 4/4 enchantment creature. When it enters, it deals 4 damage to each opponent, and if you have Delirium, when a source you control deals non-com damage to an opponent, if you have Delirium, Fear of Burning Alive deals that match damage to target creature an opponent controls. So just a big ol' 6 mana, kill your thing, deal you 4. This card's great, really fond of this card. A card that I've been pleasantly surprised with actually in the more aggressive versions of this deck is Hand That Feeds. Kind of looks a little bit junky, but I found it to be pretty good. 1 and a red for a 2/2. But if you have Delirium, it gets +2 and Menace when you attack with it. So a 4/2 Menace that comes down turn 2. It's a little bit like Patchwork Beastie, to be honest. It can attack and block normally, but, kind of just sits there and becomes a big threat after a few turns if your deck is built correctly. And then to cap off our talk about the archetypes, just touching on the ones that I didn't go in depth on, and I'm probably going to touch a little bit more on these on future weeks, but did want to shout them out because, like I mentioned, I think basically every archetype is playable in this set. The one that I think is just generically good, maybe a little bit less good than the other decks we talk about, but I've just liked this deck, is Black-Red Sacrifice. The card Disturbing Mirth, which is the black-red signposting common, it's an enchantment. When it enters, you can sacrifice another enchantment or creature. If you do, draw 2 cards. And then when you sacrifice Disturbing Mirth, Manifest Dread, this card's super strong. Like, just such an efficient little package. In Black-Red, there's a bunch of little things to sacrifice. Your rooms that you just play, and you've used their effects, and you can sacrifice those. Disturbing Mirth plays extremely well in multiples because you can just keep chaining them, play one, sacrifice one to another, keep drawing cards. So if you've got multiples of this, great. But you don't need multiples of this card to be good. A single copy is going to be good in your black-red deck. But the black-red deck as a aggressive deck with some sacrifice energies, like I don't think you get to be super sacrifice heavy, but I found it to be generally pretty functional. And then we've got the not-so-great decks in the format that, aside from green-white, which we're going to get to that one last, I think have some legs. So we've got blue-red rooms. I've already drafted 2 really good versions of this deck, and I saw LSV draft a really good version too. I think that what's going on with blue-red rooms, which is currently the worst performing deck in the format, aggregate on 17 lands, it is a control deck, and it's a blue control deck, and both those things, control deck and blue cards, tend to be things that, especially in the early weeks of limited formats, are things that are underrepresented by the win rate data, because the average player has more trouble building a control deck than a aggro deck. They also have more trouble evaluating blue cards. I think that the uncommon Smoky Lounge Misty Salon, this is the red room that 3 mana, on your first main phase, you make 2 red mana, but you can only use this to unlock doors and cast rooms. And Misty Salon, which is the 3 in a blue room, that when you unlock it, you make an XX spirit, where X is the number of unlocked doors amongst room you control. I think this card is a really good enabler for the deck. And really a payoff and enabler, honestly. I think you're looking for like 8 or 7 rooms to make this good, but most of the rooms, this isn't actually something I've talked about too much throughout this episode, but most of the rooms I think are just good cards, and they look a little bit clunky. But if you just kind of think of them as creatures with a bit of an extra bonus on top, mana sink, or removal spells with a bit of an extra bonus mana sink, there's like Glassworks, which is 3 mana, deal 4, and you can unlock the 5 mana side, which is an enchantment that pings every upkeep. Supplement those cards with card draw and removal, or red's removal, blue's card draw, and I don't see anything too wrong with that. So I am cautiously optimistic about this deck still. Like I said, I've had good experiences. I've seen other good players have good experiences. So we'll see how it shakes out in the data. We'll see where this lands in the top player data, and if, the average win rate of blue cards goes up as the format goes on. Similarly, I think blue-black is in a similar place. Blue-black Eerie control. Similar thing where, it's a control deck, and control decks are generally hard to build. But one thing that is a bit of a trap, actually, though, is the card Fear of Infinity, one of the blue-black signposts and commons here. This is 1 blue-black for a 2/2 enchantment creature with flying and lifelink, but it can't block. And Eerie, whenever you fully unlock a room, you can return Fear of Infinity from your graveyard to your hand. I don't think this card's unplayable or anything, but I think it's not a great card. Like, 2/2 lifelink flying, but the can't block part of this really takes a lot away from it. And yes, lifelink makes up for that somewhat, but it turns it from a unplayable card completely to a playable card. Like, I just don't think games are grinding out to the point where you're like recurring this and this is your win condition, and the times where your opponent does come off to a pretty aggressive start and this is your 3 mana play, just not going to go well for your control deck. So that's just like a little bit of vision issue where I think people are falling into the trap of thinking this is like an awesome card for the deck and they take it very highly. Again, it's a playable card, but where I've been talking up all the signposts and commons saying they've been fantastic, this one just not so much. So blue-red, blue-black kind of have the same issue why I think they're not performing well. White-black, Reanimator, or at least build as a Reanimator deck. I think the issue with this is that the reanimation stuff is just a little bit finicky. It's finicky to get a creature in the graveyard and then pair that with a removal spell and then have that thing stick and that take over the game. Like, your reanimation target has to be strong enough that it's worth jumping through all these hoops. And, it's not that hard to fill up your grave with Manifest Dread, but then you also have to draw your reanimation spell, and it's just a lot of hoops to jump through. And these hoops aren't impossible to jump through, but the other decks don't have as many hoops, and it just comes down to that. Now, I would like to propose 2 solutions to black-white being, one of the not-so-great decks in the format as far as the data goes. One, I think you should just build it more as a mid-range deck that aims to cast Shroud Stomper as its top end, and you could still include some reanimation, but it's more to recur Shroud Stomper after casting it and your opponent kills it, rather than be like, I'm going to reanimate my Shroud Stomper on turn 4. By the way, I should read this out. Shroud Stomper is 3 white, white, black, black for a 5/5 death touch. When it enters or attacks, each opponent loses 2 life. You gain 2 life. Great card if you can cast it. And if you're playing a slower game, cast this card, stabilize you, draw some cards. Your opponent has to deal with it. If they can't, they're just going to lose the game. And I found this card to be the most successful when, yeah, you're not spending time like discarding this to your goat, your 1/1 goat that you can pay 3 to discard a card, put 3 counters on it, then reanimating it. Again, it's a little bit finicky, a little bit too many hoops to jump through. I think just casting this card, building a deck where you're getting to 7 mana, casting this card and recurring this alone, that's a pretty good use of the black-white cards, I think. Also, like I mentioned before, you could build black-white as a bit of a black-white Eerie deck. I saw Raph Levy earlier today play a really, really great version where he was using some cards that I don't think are great in general, like the Leech, the 2-mana 2/2 Leech in black that when you trigger Eerie, your opponent loses a life. But he had a deck that was fairly aggressive, built around that stuff, and, was triggering like 5 things per turn because he did do a lot of work to make sure his deck was like, yep, here are my Eerie payoffs, here are my Eerie triggers, put them together, kind of like a blue-white deck, but just with the black Eerie cards instead. So I think those are 2 ways that you can build black-white to make it better than the proposed theme of Reanimator. I've also seen some Reanimator decks that have all the bells and whistles. They've got all the greatest reanimation spells. They've got ways to get their cards in the graveyard, a ton of Manifest Dread, maybe even good rares to reanimate. Like, it can get there, but it's just not going to happen every black-white draft when black-white is open. That's one of the hoops you have to jump through. And then there's green-white, the green-white survival deck. And this is not a terrible deck. It is one of the lesser performing decks. It's around like 53%, so just above those other decks we just talked about. But I think survival as a mechanic for a deck kind of fails in some way, because to make a survival card good enough to be like, yes, I want to play this survival card, because there's a lot of survival cards that just aren't all that exciting or all that good. But the good ones they just get poached by other decks. Like, I'm thinking the 3-mana green uncommon, it's a 3/2, and if it survives, you get to Manifest Dread. Like, that's just a good card. It's not like, the green-white player gets it. So it's, suffering from success a little bit is green-white's problem. And the other thing is that when you do truly have, like, an all-in survival deck, like, I've got all the survival cards and ways to tap down my cards, then you're just playing this aggro deck that is just a little bit finicky, right? Again, it kind of like black-white, just hoops to jump through that other decks don't have to jump through. And I've played a fine green-white deck before, just like kind of base white aggro, maybe eerie enchantment base with some green cards. Like, that can certainly work, but I just think it's a deck that's going to come together a little bit less often than some of the other decks. And that's mostly all I have to talk about today. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, I was going to talk about some cards that I wanted to bring up that didn't really belong anywhere else, but episode ran a little bit long, so we'll port that over to next week. Come back next week. We'll be doing the card evaluation level up episode where we touch on a bunch of cards that some I talked about. We'll go more in depth, some I didn't talk about. So come back next week if you're interested in that. If you're watching on YouTube and you have not already, please do like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And yeah, I hope you're enjoying this set. I know I am, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.